All right, everybody. So I think we'll get started here and people can just continue to file in here. So I will get my screen set up. Okay, so welcome everybody to part 2 of our substrate focus sessions for the Getting Into the Weeds series. My name is Talia Plaskett. I'm the Protected Crop Specialist at Perennia, and I will be your host for today. And I want to say thank you all for joining us. I'm excited to be able to dive into this topic and really, start to figure out the best way to irrigate your substrate system. Oops, sorry. And so for those of you who missed our first session on Soilless substrate a few weeks back, be sure to check out the recording on YouTube just to help set the baseline on some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. So before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items to touch on. All participants have their audio and video turned off during the webinar, so you don't have to worry about frantically looking for those buttons. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can also use the chat function as well. So both of these boxes are going to be monitored throughout the session, and we will address them in the live Q&A session happening at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar will also be recorded, and we will upload it onto YouTube at a later date. Also, CEU credits will be available at the end of the session, so be sure to stick around for that. Perennia's vision is that Nova Scotia is a recognized world leader in producing innovative, environmentally responsible, and safe food of impeccable quality. And in order to do that, we will be supporting the growth, transformation, and economic development in Nova Scotia's agriculture, seafood, and food and beverage sectors. Perennia is a multifaceted company, and we provide support to the agriculture sector, quality and food safety, product development, lab services, and fisheries. For those of you who have not seen the Minister of Agriculture digital series, take note of the dates listed here and for some interesting and relevant topics to the industry. And for those of you who saw the advertisement for the seafood series, the last session took place April 8th, so be sure to check out the recordings of those sessions as well.
Talia, could I just intervene and say I'm not sure if you're sharing your screen or not. I don't see it.
Are you serious? Really?
Yeah.
What
Sunny,
do you?
Can you see it?
I'm not seeing it either. No, I'm not.
Really? I'm sorry. Yeah, I think I just went through that whole thing without sharing it.
There you go.
Yikes. Okay, well, you heard everything I had to say, so I will just start sharing it now.
I think it was just the dates that might have been useful.
Yes, so here are the dates. The one time you don't confirm it and you actually, I'm not sharing at all. So there you go. So these are the dates for the Minister of Agriculture digital series. And now we will actually get started. So today's topic is going to be managing your substrate irrigation system. So part 1 of the substrate series took a closer look at soilless growing media, and we examined the differences in air and water holding capacities and what that means for your crop. And so today we're going to be building on this a little bit. So now that you've chosen a substrate, we're going to have to come up with an irrigation plan. So identifying those key triggers for irrigation events, deciding when in the day they should happen, and maintaining a monitoring system to keep everything in check are some of the important things we will discuss today. As I mentioned earlier, feel free to ask any questions you may have throughout the presentation or any times afterwards during the discussion. So joining us today, we have Dennis Wilson. He is the Managing Director and Senior Berry Fruit Agronomist for Delphy UK. He has 35 years of professional experience in berry production, acting as a farm manager, researcher, and an agronomist. Dennis was involved in the first commercial strawberry and raspberry substrate production projects in the UK in 1991, and is well versed in the challenges of transitioning into and managing a soilless production system. So with that, Dennis, take it from here.
Oh, thanks, Talia. So, okay, let me see if I can share mine, and please let me know if I if I fail.
Yes.
So, can you see that?
No.
Okay. Right. Let's see if we can find another way to do it then. Stop sharing. we'll try that way. How's that? Is that
Looks
working?
good. Yeah.
Okay, we got there in the end. Okay, right. Let me just get back to the beginning. Current slide and minimize
Looks
this.
good.
Okay, so yeah, for those of you who were present in the first irrigation substrate section, then I'm going to draw on some of the principles and some of the aspects that we touched on. For those of you that weren't present, say it might be worth referring back to them, but I'll try and also sort of have an explanation of certain principles as I go through the slides. Okay, so the first thing to think about is if we're moving from soil to substrate, there's some really important differences in the way that we're going to have to manage the crops, particularly as far as irrigation. So I'm just going to highlight some of the differences between growing and irrigating in soil-grown crops and the way that we would have to manage the irrigation for our substrate-grown crops. And so I've got a couple of headings, and I'll briefly summarize it, and then we'll look at different aspects of these as I go through the slides. So the first thing is that in terms of our volume of root, then we see that a substrate-grown crop, we've got a very small root volume compared to the same crop grown in soil. And those of you who were present in the first webinar, I showed a slide of raspberries in my garden where we have the root system growing for 2 meters beyond the original plantation, and that in substrate, then we'll put the whole plant into a 5 or a 7 litre pot, and we've got only 1% of the root volume in that pot that we have that the plant can grow in the soil. So clearly we've got this very minimalized, miniaturized root system, and as a result then we have to think about a different way of irrigating. The first thing to bear in mind is because we've got a lot less surface area of roots, then we haven't necessarily got the suction power that a soil-grown crop with a much bigger area that the roots can grow into, and probably a much larger volume of roots per plant has. So we keep the substrate at much lower moisture tension. We make it as easy as possible for the plant to absorb the water, but clearly there are some, as we said in the first webinar, we can overdo that side of things. We can keep the substrate too wet. So we have to think about how we're going to manage that. But generally, we're trying to keep the substrate at a much lower moisture tension than with the soil. And also, because we have this very small root volume, if we've got a big plant, it means that they're going to suck all the moisture out, or suck the moisture out to an extent that the tension rises and it becomes difficult for the plant to absorb moisture quite quickly. So a fully grown substrate crop, like these raspberries you can see, they'll suck that pot dry in an hour or two in a hot sunny day. So we start to move towards a little and often irrigation strategy to try and keep pace with the water demand of the crop, but obviously not put any, the amount of water we put on any individual irrigation cycle not be so much that it floods the plants and it's wasting a lot of water and fertilizer. But yeah, very often on a hot sunny day with a raspberry crop or a tomato crop grown in a coir substrate or rockwool substrate, we'll be dripping it 20 or even up to 30 times a day, small short cycles, to make sure that we provide sufficient moisture, keep the tension low enough to keep the plant growing, but obviously avoid overwetting. And we'll talk about how we manage that whole process as we go through the slides. The other really important thing is we often talk about the crop water demand, the ET, evapotranspiration. But clearly for a substrate grown crop, our irrigated surface area is much smaller. And also you can see that for many of our crops, there's no exposed soil or substrate at all. So our substrate grown crops, then if you want to call it the whole crop, the ET demand is pretty much aligned to transpiration and the transpiration demand of that crop, because the evaporation part of the equation that we might normally use is significantly reduced. So we need to factor that in. The third thing that's very different is that we normally have runoff on substrate grown crops. And we define that basically as excess irrigation. We irrigate to the point where the substrate can no longer hold the volume of water that we put into it, and some will drain away. And again, I'll talk about this in more detail as we go through the slides. That's to help us manage the variability that we'll get from one pot or one bag to another because of variability in the output of the drip system, variability in the climate, variability in the plant size. There's a whole range of variations that can occur. And if we water to the one particular location and have almost no runoff, then more than likely in many other locations we'll have some quite dry pots, because there'll be differences in the amount of water that they receive and also that they use. And also in terms of managing the conductivity and the accumulation of some of the unused ions that aren't used by the plant in the drip irrigation water, then usually there's a certain amount of flushing that we have to do to wash that through and avoid the build-up of concentrations. So we use this principle of runoff, excess irrigation, to try and manage it, and we'll talk about it in more detail. We try and keep it to the minimum, but it's an essential part of growing in substrate, which is not really a consideration when we're growing in soil. So the other thing that's really important when we're growing in substrate is that, yes, we've got a free draining substrate, but the container that we hold it in has a drainage restriction. It's got a solid base usually. The pots or the bags that we grow into haven't got a completely hollow base for obvious reasons, that we need to have it contained within a particular sort of volume, and so that we can move it and manage it, and we can't have a completely open system. So the containers might have holes or slits in their base, and these are going to form an impediment to the outflow of runoff. And so again, we have to manage our irrigation volume and frequency so that we don't get a large backup, if you want to call it, of excess irrigation that we've applied from previous drip cycles. We need to really carefully think about the frequency that we apply the water and the amount that we apply in any one individual cycle to ensure that we give enough for the crop, but we don't end up saturating our plants for long parts of the day. And the other last thing to say is that that runoff water has to escape. We don't want it sitting around our crop for obvious reasons. It can obviously again then cause saturation. It can harbour diseases, and so it's a really important principle for substrate that, as well as having good drainage from our container, we channel that water away to try and avoid it hanging around the crop, the roots of the crop, and causing us a problem. So let me just see if I can hide that one. There you go. So let's just think about some of the principles that I talked about there in more detail. So first of all, when we talked about the water demand of our crop, and we talked about the fact that as far as substrate grown plant, then ET demand is mostly the T. Transpiration is dominant, evaporation is relatively small. So when we think about water use by plants, how important is this transpiration? Well, this is a typical division, if you want to call it, of water use by most plants. And about 1% of the water that they take up from the root zone, whether it's substrate or soil, is used in photosynthesis. water plus CO2 to make sugars. Around about 9% is used for growth and turgor maintenance, as we call it, i.e. cell division for growth, cell expansion for maintaining turgor and also to allow tissues to expand to their fullest size. And that leaves about 90% of the water that the plants absorb from soil or substrate being used for transpiration. And as you probably know, essentially transpiration is the water being taken up through the roots, moving through the water transport system, the xylem, and then exiting the plant via pores, stomata. And most of those pores are in the leaves. And you can see the effect of transpiration very easily if you put a plastic bag over a plant like we've got here, and you see the water vapor that starts to materialize because of this transpiration process. So for every litre of water our crop takes up, then 900 mils of that water is used in transpiration, which seems quite a wasteful thing to be doing for a plant, to actually waste 9/10 of the water that it absorbs. And if you're growing in the desert, it would be an extremely wasteful thing to do. Most of the plants that we grow as crops evolved in regions where, temperate regions, where there was reasonably good water supply. So they can generally replenish the water they have. So they don't necessarily need to be adapted to conserve water. They thrive better when they're freely transpiring. And so what use is this transpiration? Why is it so important for the plants, and why do they do much better? So essentially, firstly, it's for the supply of water to those developing cells for growth and for photosynthesis. That 10% has to be absorbed, moved around in the xylem system and moved to the targets where the water is needed. And also, you probably know that some nutrients, particularly calcium and boron, are mostly transported in the xylem system. So it's an important distribution principle that we need good transpiration and constant transpiration to get good levels of calcium and boron to our crops. So that serves a useful function. But probably the most important function is cooling the plants. So the water, like mammals, then the plants need to evaporate water, and the energy used in evaporation helps cool the plants. So water is evaporated through the pores in the leaf, the stomata, and helps to cool the plants. And we see that an actively transpiring plant is often 4 or 5, even sometimes more, 6 or 7 degrees cooler than the surrounding air. And if for any reason the plant stops transpiring, it comes under stress, we call it, and it closes its stomata, the leaf starts to heat up. And we can actually see that process in action. I'll show you a picture in a minute, how the leaf will heat up when the plant becomes stressed. The stress can be due to a number of reasons. It can be due to the substrate getting a bit too dry, the climate that the plant is growing in being more aggressive. We talk about VPD, vapor pressure deficit, which is essentially the relation between air temperature and humidity. And with high air temperature and low humidity, then more evaporation can occur. So that's a very, we have exceptionally high temperature and low humidity, the water loss in the plant becomes very high. And that can cause stress. The plant can't replace the amount of water that's lost. And so to prevent it wilting, it closes its stomata, transpiration stops. Same with high wind speed or even damage to the plants. And we see that a stressed leaf can be 5 or 7 degrees warmer than surrounding air. Plants effectively being cooked in its own juices. And you can easily see this with thermal imaging cameras. And so you can see here, this is a picture of a cucumber leaf, and the top picture is an actively transpiring leaf. And you can see the leaf is blue, the ambient air is green, so it's nice and cool. The bottom picture is a non-transpiring leaf, and you see what happens. And this can happen in a relatively short period of time, particularly in substrate, we can go from the plant having sufficient water to satisfy the ET demand, the transpiration demand, according to the climate, the size of the plant, wind speed, a whole range of other factors. And then if it starts to extract too much water from the substrate too quickly and we don't replenish it, then it comes under stress. And we see this change in temperature of the leaf with the thermal imaging camera. Very quickly, it goes from several degrees cooler than the ambient air to quite a few degrees warmer than the ambient air. And okay, that's a visual indication, but what's happening with that plant then is it can't cool itself. It can't photosynthesize, so therefore it can't make sugars. So that's going to affect the growth of the plant. And if we have a flower or a fruit that we're developing, that's usually a big sink for sugars. So that's going to have a big effect on the quality and the size of that destination tissue. And it can't get its supply of calcium or boron. So we see a whole range of plants. So in substrate, it's really important that we're right on top of this change in the moisture content to avoid this rapid change in the stress levels of the plant and the knock-on consequences. So we try and closely match, if you want to call it, the ET demand, which is mostly transpiration, with our irrigation supply on an hourly basis. We don't think about the daily ET demand, we think about what's happened in each hour of the day, and we try and make sure that during that hour we've supplied enough water to cope with the ET demand so that the substrate doesn't dry out too much and we get a very quickly a stressed plant. So our aim basically with substrate irrigation is to try and match the supply of water to the hourly ET demand. So to give you some idea of what's going on, here's some work that's been done on gerberas, flower crop, but you can apply it to pretty much any crop at all and growing in any situation, but you can then see how important it is for our substrate grown crops to be able to be on top of this process. So we've got two different temperature regimes, if you want to call it, growing climates. We've got early spring, so we have a shorter day length and a cooler day, and the middle of the summer when we have much warmer temperatures, almost 30 degrees, and a longer day. And what you can see is the bars, the vertical bars on the bottom, are the ET demand, the water demand on an hourly basis under these conditions. And clearly you can see that ET demand increases as the temperature increases. And we usually say for an unheated crop grown in tunnels or even outside or in a glass house, then that temperature is quite closely correlated with the solar radiation. So obviously solar radiation increases, temperature increases, the hourly water demand increases. And you can see moving from early in the season to the middle of the summer, the solar radiation levels are double and the ET demand, the bars, rise proportionately. And you can see also that in both seasons, around 60 to 70% of the ET demand is between the hours of 10 and 4 p.m. In the summer, then it lasts a little bit longer. We get a bit more happening at 5 or even 6 p.m. But essentially, on most days, around 60 to 70% of the ET demand is going to be between these hours, between 10 and 4. You can also see that around about 7% of the ET demand happens at night, even in the dark period. And this may be because there's some evaporation from the surface, if it's exposed. It may be that not all the stomata are closed. They didn't read the books that said at night stomata close. It may be because of escape of water through the cuticle. Or it may just be that there's osmosis going on and more is being absorbed by the plants, but it's not necessarily being transpired. So we see that this pattern occurs for most crops in many growing situations, and we try and then look at that way that the water is used by the plants and manage our irrigation substrate accordingly. So I mentioned the VPD before. When I do these irrigation courses, as I was saying to Talia, then quite often I do a long course, lasts 4 or 5 hours, and we talk in great detail about VPD, vapor pressure deficit, the relation between the temperature and the humidity. So suffice to say, for this webinar, we see that in the summer, the VPD is higher than what we would consider to be a nice level, an easy level for the plant to cope with. We say a VPD of over 1.2 kilopascals. So during the summer period, then often the VPD is higher. So that plant is already under a bit of stress. In the spring, we see that particularly overnight, the VPD is much lower. And so we see that we have conditions of cool temperatures, high humidity, but you can see there's still some water uptake for the crop. There's still osmosis going on. And that leads generally to what we call a build-up of root pressure, which can cause us a few issues, which in this webinar I don't have time to go through. But so this is what's going on in terms of the hourly demand for water from our crops grown in soil and substrate, but in substrate we have to be much smarter at managing it because of the very limited root volume and the quick transition from stress, from optimal to stress, or from optimal to supersaturated. So we formulate these sort of golden rules, if you want to call it, of dripping and substrate, how we try and manage this process. So generally we start dripping 1 to 2 hours after sunrise. We wait till there's actually some temperature rise. The VPD might be starting to go down, so there's likely to be some actual transpiration going on in our crop, so it's effectively using water. And we finish 1 to 3 hours before sunset. We don't necessarily go on irrigating all through the night because we see that the water demand is much lower. And also we'll introduce the concept of saying when the transpiration is low, we try and help the plants and the roots recover by drying the substrate back a bit. So when we have low transpiration, typically at night with the humidity rising and the temperature declining, but also during rainy and very cold weather conditions, we tolerate a slightly higher tension in our crops. We allow the substrate to dry back a little to help get a little bit more air into the root zone, to make sure that our plant root health is as good as it possibly can be. It's not sitting too wet too much of the time. And then we also try and get some runoff for pretty much every drip cycle. I see it's not uncommon for me when I walk around raspberry and strawberry fields that I look after, then where growers haven't necessarily got their irrigation right, we see that on a hot summer day, we see plenty of runoff early in the morning. And then in the middle of the day, in that peak transpiration period, around about 12, 1, 2 p.m., we see very little runoff. And then towards the end of the day, as it cools down, we see more runoff. And essentially what's going on is that crop isn't being irrigated frequently enough in the middle of the day, so that's leading to stress, closure of stomata, effect on the growth, and it's being probably over-irrigated at the beginning and end of the day, partly to try and compensate and partly because the grower is perhaps not paying attention to the ET demand of this crop. So I often say you can set a substrate crop up to grow, and you can very carefully monitor the runoff with a runoff monitoring station that we'll talk about. And if you just irrigate it once a day, it's quite possible to get 25% runoff. So you turn up in the morning and measure 25% runoff from your crop that you achieved the previous day, but you've actually no idea when that runoff occurred. And in theory, it's possible just to irrigate it once in the morning, get a very high runoff, and then it's bone dry for the rest of the day, but you effectively said, well, I've achieved 25% runoff. We're trying to be smarter than that, trying to make sure that we get runoff on virtually all our irrigation cycles. We make an exception for first thing in the morning. So we say if the first drip in the morning gave some runoff, then most likely that was either too early in the day, or we just gave it too much water towards the end of the previous day. We've left it a little bit too dry overnight. So we aim to start runoff on the second or the third drip cycle of the morning. And that way we can be sure that overnight the plant has had a little bit of a dry back, but not excessively, where people maybe have been a little bit too positive in drying back at night, and we don't see irrigation, we don't see runoff until the fourth or fifth drip cycle of the day. Then we say to them, well, actually you've been a little bit too aggressive with your dry back, and that's probably having an effect on the water uptake and the EC in your substrate. Aim for runoff on the second or third drip cycle of the day. And clearly, as I've said before, we're applying water little and often. And we have some general sort of guidelines that we follow. So if we've got crops where the root miniaturization isn't quite so extensive as with other crops, then we'll apply 1 to 2% of the container volume per drip cycle. So typically we do that for strawberries and blueberries in the sector that I operate in. Where we've got more miniaturization, we've got a bigger crop and smaller root volume, then we start to apply more per drip cycle because they dry out faster. So we have to basically give more volume per drip cycle, so 2 to 4%. And I'm aware that for salad crops grown in rockwool, and also certain advisors that are saying the same for crops grown in coir, they would go for 3 to 6% of the container volume for each drip cycle. The rationale being that maybe they keep the substrate a bit wetter, or that the water use is much greater, and particularly under glasshouse conditions. But you can see we're applying relatively small amounts, whether it's 1% or 6% of the volume with each drip cycle, but we're trying to apply them sufficiently frequently to keep the moisture content, the tension level optimal for our plants. And this means generally on hot days, then we cluster the drip cycles around that 10 to 4 p.m. Period, because that's when the high hourly ET demand is. Okay, and so you can imagine for a small crop with a freshly planted crop, hasn't received a particularly large amount of temperature, hasn't grown a big leaf area, then we would have a different irrigation strategy to a big crop with grown full leaf canopy and a lot of fruit. So as well as the weather, we're thinking about the canopy and the water uptake of that plant. So we'll have basically infrequent drip cycles, and we'll try and manage the moisture content, the runoff, so that we don't irrigate them too frequently, so we don't have excess runoff. Clearly, once the plant grows and we've got a much bigger, larger canopy, we're going to have to irrigate, particularly in this peak period, a lot more frequently. And then we think about towards the end of the day, then when are we going to stop? And that's going to depend on a number of factors. It might depend on how hot the night is, and if it's a very warm night, we might even irrigate till quite late in the evening. Or if it's a very cool night, often in the spring and the autumn, we get quite a big transition from nice warm days to quite cool evenings. And at that point, we have to be careful about when we make our last drip cycle of the day. If we make it too close to sunset, then the substrate can sit a bit too wet overnight, and that can cause us some issues with root pressure and just the roots sitting too wet. So part of the skill, if you want to call it, of irrigating in substrate is to be able to look at when your first and last cycle should be, as well as how frequently you need to drip between the cycles. And I'm going to talk about various aids that we use to help us with that as we go through the slides. The other thing that's quite important is once we start growing in pots or in bags, then we need to think about how many drippers we need to put in to that container to get good water distribution. It's no good having a huge pot or a huge bag and only one dripper. So I can give you some experience in berries as we go through, but I just want to help you understand what's going on when we irrigate with what we call point sources, so drippers themselves. That water can basically travel in two different directions under two different forces. First of all, we've got gravity that pulls the water downwards, and then we have capillary action, that the water will spread sideways through smaller pores into dry soil. So we've got downwards and sideways movement. And as I mentioned in the last the first webinar on substrate, we have different physical components in the substrate, and that will affect the size of the pores. And what we see is if we've got a substrate with a very large number of small particles, so we've got lots of small pores, lots of small gaps between them, then we get a lot of capillary action. So we get this fatter wetting cycle. And if you analyze it carefully, you can see it's concentric layers. So it's not necessarily evenly spread. Each layer has a particular moisture content, and then it moves to another horizon, as we call it. When we go to a substrate that's got lots of big particles, so it's got larger pore sizes, the gravity pulls that water down before it has much chance to spread sideways. So what we then see is a much narrower elliptical wetting pattern. So knowledge of the substrate is quite important to understand how many drippers we might need in a grow bag or in a pot. And it's quite important to match that up, and I'll show you in the next slide how we have looked at that in our berry crops. Because what we need is, if we've got more than one dripper per container, we want to try and get those wetting patterns to merge. We don't want them, sorry, let's go to last viewed. We don't want a large dry spot in the space between the two emitters. We want it to be spreading as evenly and as uniformly as possible. So with the crops that I work with berries, we spent quite a long time looking at this. How many drippers for different size pots? And originally, when we started growing, we had a 5-litre pot, and we put 1 2-litre per hour dripper in it. But very quickly, we found that we got quite uneven moisture distribution, especially towards the top of the pot. And with that led to quite uneven root distribution. So that's affecting our water and nutrient uptake. And also, as you can imagine, if one of those drippers is damaged or pulled out or not working, we suddenly start to see a lot of dry areas or dry pots. So very quickly, many growers moved to using 2 drippers in a pot. So this is quite a common example where we have a 4.7-litre pot, 3 raspberry canes in it, and we've got 2 drippers, and that helps give more uniform moisture distribution and reduces that risk of everything drying out if one of those emitters is damaged or pulled out. And we typically would say give 200 to 300 mils per drip cycle per pot. And so we've got 2 litre an hour drippers in that pot. That's about a 3 to 4.5 minute drip cycle. Sometimes we use slightly lower output drippers, 1.5 litre an hour drippers, so we need a slightly longer drip cycle to get that 200 to 300 mils. Growers that have moved to larger pots, 7 or 10 litres is quite commonly used as well. We found some problems with 2 drippers, and very often people use 3 drippers, and that sounds like overkill. People say, wow, that's an awful lot of drippers in a small pot. What we found was that we got very much more even distribution of water and fertilizer, and we actually used a lot less water and fertilizer than we did with 2 drippers, because we're not trying to give extra water to wet up some of these drier areas. And one of the problems we saw particularly is we see in the corners of a large pot with only 2 drippers, the fertilizer moves outwards with the water and then gets deposited in the corners. And you can see hopefully there that we've got a salt buildup in the corners of that pot, 7-litre pot with 2 drippers, and we've got quite a big salt build-up. We hardly ever see the same salt build-up when we move to 3 emitters per pot. So this is just something from the sector that I work with that we've observed, and the general principle is we prefer slightly more point sources, and if necessary with a lower output, to give very uniform distribution of water and nutrients in our containers. And obviously if we've got 3 drippers in a slightly larger pot, we can have a slightly larger volume of water applied in each drip cycle, which is with 3 drippers means actually slightly shorter drip cycle, because we've got 3 instead of 2 drippers. So 2.5 to 3.5 minutes with 3 2-litre-an-hour drippers, when we've got 3 drippers in a 7 or 10-litre pot. So the other thing to think about, really important thing to think about, is how the water drains through our pots. So all containers, bags, troughs, pots, they're going to have drainage holes, we hope, at their base, so the excess water can drain away. And the general principle is more holes, better drainage, less chance of waterlogging. And for the crops that I'm working with, then raspberries are particularly sensitive. So a recent development is, as well as the drainage holes in the base of the pot, there's now a grid as well to try and maximise the through drainage and get rid of the excess water as far as possible. And also we have the pots on a prominent leg, so that we have this air gap underneath the pot, and that stops the drainage holes being blocked when the pot is put on a ground cover surface or onto bare soil even. But also it keeps the roots within the pot itself, so we get what we call air pruning, and that's very good for keeping control of our plants. We don't get this rooting through that you can see here, which is a classic example of where the roots have grown through the drainage hole and into the soil. And that gives us much more control over the water and nutrient status of that plant, and also a lot lower risk of problems with catching soil-borne diseases like Phytophthora or Verticillium or Fusarium. So those are quite important principles when we grow in pots. With grow bags, then again, we have drainage holes. This is quite an exaggerated version. We don't normally see so many drainage holes, but the idea is that, again, the water will be able to drain freely from the bottom of the bag itself. I know for many salad crops, instead of drainage holes, people use slits as well. And there's a slightly different way of formulating the substrate and irrigating, but the principle is the same. We need to allow the excess water to escape. So I just want to talk briefly about runoff. It's a quite a big topic in Northern Europe. People are becoming increasingly environmentally aware, and there's a lot of pressure on water resources as well. So clearly the horticulture industry often gets targeted by people saying, well, you're putting all this excess water on and it's carrying a lot of fertilizer and it's creating problems with pollution. And, you know, we accept that there is a, if you want to call it, a waste disposal issue, and that as an industry, we have to manage it. But we can't do without runoff. You know, many people say, well, just stop giving any runoff and then you have you cure the problem. But you probably know, and I'm just going to try and explain to you why runoff is what we call a necessary evil for our substrate crops. So firstly, as I mentioned before, the drippers themselves, they start off with a nominal output, say 2 litres an hour. But even when they're brand new, it's not a precision piece of equipment, and there's some variation. Some drippers give slightly higher output than others. And so we can see, even if the plants were the same, the climate was the same, some pots would get a bit more water than others. And so if we irrigate with no runoff at all, then some of the pots will probably be okay, but a lot of them will be too dry. So if we just allow some excess irrigation, that hopefully will not be enough to over-irrigate those pots that are getting the most water, but it will allow those getting slightly less to be at the ideal moisture tension. And then the water use of the plants can be very different. Pot grown plants particularly, whether it's a raspberry or a tree or something else, we see huge differences depending on the size of the plants, depending on the topography and the slope, the wind. Sometimes have different sizes of pots as well. There's a whole range of variables that can creep in. So again, if we have no runoff at all, we start to see some of the pots becoming very dry because they have more water use there because of the topography or the size of the plant, or they have a slightly smaller volume, so they store less water. So we have to try and even that out by giving a certain amount of excess water. And then we have a problem with managing the salt level in our pots. We're fertilizing to try and maximize the growth of the plants. And sometimes we give too much fertilizer. Sometimes there are just elements in the water source like sodium, chloride, sulfate that are not used in great quantities or even at all by our plants, but are present in the water. And then they just build up over the course of the season and they start to interfere with the growth of our plants. So we try and flush some of those out by giving some runoff to try and manage the concentration of those ions. And there are certain other ions like boron, sometimes silicon, that are also, the plant can use some of them, but very quickly there can be too much. And then again, it causes some toxicity problems. So again, we try and flush some of those out by having a slight excess of irrigation. And then, as we know, over the course of the season, then the plants use some elements that they in more higher quantities than others. And there comes a point when, if we do an analysis of the substrate, we see that it's quite unbalanced in terms of the amounts of nutrients that are present and what we think is the ideal amounts of nutrients, concentrations of nutrients for the growth of those plants. So again, we use some excess irrigation to try and even up the balance. So clearly there's lots of reasons why we might want to use runoff, but we also should try to minimize the amount that we give, because otherwise we run the risk of overwatering, we waste water and fertilizers. All that water has to go somewhere and it can create mud or algae or grass or weed growth, extra humidity in the tunnels. It also decomposes the substrate much more quickly if it's kept too wet for too long. And environmentally, then it puts us in a weak position to deal with concerns, and even within the EU, then legal directives that say there's only a certain amount of nitrogen or phosphorus that can be discharged into watercourses, and in parts of Holland and Belgium, then there's nothing. You cannot discharge any nitrogen-containing fluid into a water source. So managing that runoff is really important, and so we do that by using a lysimeter, some people call it, a runoff collection point. And the really important aspect is that that runoff collection point's got to be representative of our whole crop. Very often when I walk into a field, whether it's strawberries or I see sometimes in other crops, nursery stock and various other things, I see the pots that have been selected to be the ones where they catch the drainage water, the runoff, poking up above, sticking up above the level of all the other crops. And all that means is those particular pots are experiencing more airflow, so they use more water than the rest of the crop. So therefore you're overwatering your crop because you've selected some plants that have actually got higher water use than the rest of your field. So it's really important to have them at the same level as your original crop. And then the sample you take is only as good as the sampling technique. And clearly, if we have variation in water use, water supply from one pot to another, the more pots, bags, containers we can include in our sample collection, the closer idea we've got of the average for the field as a whole, not just that one pot. So that gives us a better sample to estimate the runoff. And then for each irrigation valve, then we should have one runoff collection point, and that may mean hundreds of them in a large farm with lots of different irrigation valves with lots of crops. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sample every valve every day, but you need to have that facility to be able to check at some point. And the valves where we do decide to do a runoff check, then usually I say best thing is to check it twice a day rather than just once a day. Just before the first irrigation of the day, because that's generally the driest point in our irrigation cycle. And that way we can start the day, if we have finished with virtually no runoff, we collect, then we think maybe it's a bit dry, and we might do other assessments, but that gives us an idea that maybe we need to put a little bit more water on to start with, otherwise it will stay too dry for the rest of the day. And then in our peak water use period, midday, early afternoon, we see how well our irrigation settings are coping with the demand for our crop. And so we can make corrections in good time. And a few other little things then, if our drain sample, again, 2 or more drippers to account for variation. And if we're measuring pH, then if we exclude the light, that helps reduce algal growth, and that gives us a more stable pH reading than if it's open to the light, and algae can grow in it and absorb and give out CO2, and the dissolved CO2 has a big influence on the pH of that water. So that's how we make sure that we're getting sufficient runoff. And then how are we going to decide on how frequently we water? We've sort of indicated that we give a certain volume each cycle, depending on the size of the crop and the crop itself. And we want to get some runoff. So how frequently do we need to irrigate? And we can do that in lots of different ways. The lowest tech way is we do what we call timed starts. So we just set on the clock. We say we water every hour or every 45 minutes or whatever, so that we try and guess the water demand of our plants and set the timer to come on at particular times to reflect that. Clearly, if the weather changes from one day to the next or within the day, then you can quite often be out. So I do have growers that still use timers, but they spend a lot of time readjusting all the time to weather conditions to make sure that they're not over or under watering. So you could say it's probably a relatively inaccurate method unless you put an awful lot of labour into adjusting your timings of irrigation. Probably the most common method that's used, not necessarily saying it's the best method, is to use weather station data. I mentioned before that there's a fairly close correlation between solar radiation, temperature, VPD and crop water use. They all tend to follow a similar pattern. So you can use solar radiation to track the ET demand and adjust your irrigation according to a particular interval of energy from the sun. We call it rad sun. So based on the amount of accumulated joules you get, and that gives us a relatively close correlation between the water use of the plants and the water supply if we set it on a particular rad sun level. Some growers use VPD, and that can again estimate from temperature, humidity. That gives us an estimate of the water use of the plant. So weather station data is quite useful. It's really easy, very easy to gather on farm yourself, and very easy to link in with an irrigation controller. You have to be careful using weather station data that you need to take account of 2 things. First of all, if the substrate starts off the day a bit too dry because you didn't give enough the day before, then it's going to stay dry throughout the rest of the day unless you bring that moisture level up to a higher level to start with, because it's just going to basically follow the moisture demand, and if you're already too dry, it's never going to catch up. Second thing, things like wind can have quite a big influence on the water use of your crop, and temperature and humidity are not really going to account for that. So sometimes we see on a windy day, then we have a much higher water use than we might expect. So we need to take account of that. Another method that's used is root zone sensors. So you can put some sensors in your substrate in a container, in a bag or a trough or a pot, and measure either the moisture content, what we call the VMC, the volumetric percentage moisture content, or even measure the tension using a tensiometer. And these then can give you a really good indication of how the water use of your container is progressing, and you can set to irrigate at a particular, when the moisture content drops to a particular level or the tension rises to a particular level, you can trigger irrigation events. So that's following the water demand of the crop quite well. Clearly, you have to make sure that where you set your sensor up, it's representative of the crop as a whole. Otherwise, you could be following one pot that's behaving very differently to the rest of your field. Another common system that's used in greenhouses is weighing of the crop. It's a similar principle. You're weighing the water content essentially of the crop, and as it uses more water, it gets a bit drier, and so then you irrigate according to a change in the weight when it gets to a particular threshold period. A lot of glasshouse growers use it in tunnels, in the sort of a lot of farmers and growers I deal with who've got quite large areas of substrate in a relatively simple tunnel system. We find there's some problems with the wind and the fact that we're supporting some of the crop off the ground rather than hanging it from the structure. So the weighing stations don't work quite so well, but it's another methodology that's used quite commonly. The other thing is, whatever method of scheduling you're using, it's really important to have people out in the fields, out in the glasshouse, in the tunnel, doing their own checking and measuring and making sure that the data you get from whatever system you set up is representative of the rest of the field. So you need your runoff measurements, and we talk about what we call daily roving assessments. Somebody going round and having a good look, see, feel to make sure that it's representative of the crop as a whole. So how do we do that with a looking, seeing, feeling if the moisture content is right? We can set up a runoff station. So the simplest way is just to grab a handful of moist substrate and give it what we call a squeeze test. So when we're squeezing it, I often say to people, what are you testing? And usually people say, I'm testing the moisture content. And I respond by saying, no, you're not. What you're testing is the tension. You're testing how much force you need to apply to that substrate to get the water out. And that's not the same as the moisture content. Yes, the moisture it is, the easier it is. But as I mentioned before, you can have a very moisture retentive substrate with lots and lots of small particles and lots of small pores, and it might be at 50% moisture content, and you have to give it quite a firm squeeze to get moisture out. The same moisture content, 50%, if it's a relatively young, very open structured material, a very gentle squeeze will get water out of 50%. Same moisture content, as far as the plant's concerned, different tensions. So the squeeze test is a good way to try and calibrate the tension with some physical measurement. And generally we work on the basis that if you have to give it a pretty hard squeeze before you get water, then it's too dry. And even if you have to give it quite a medium squeeze for substrate, we say that's still a bit on the dry side. What we're looking for is just a gentle squeeze to start getting moisture droplets, and then we know it's relatively close to container capacity, so it's about right for our substrate crops. Clearly, if you grab hold of a handful of substrate and it runs down your arm before you've even squeezed it, it's way too wet. So, and this one, my knuckles are a bit white, and you can see some droplets. So I'm going to respond by saying I've had to squeeze that a bit harder than I would like. It's a trigger point, if you want to call it, or needed an irrigation a little bit before. So that's a good way, and it's a really, you can do lots and lots of these squeeze tests when you might have only 1 or 2 fixed runoff measuring points or fixed static measuring points. So you can get lots of data to see how that correlates with what your more sophisticated measuring points are telling you. And you can do this, in a more scientific way by sticking a microtensiometer in a pot or in a bag or in a trough. And that way you'll then get a lovely reading, if you connect it to a data logger, of how the tension varies through the day, and you can adjust your irrigation on tension. And I'll talk about that in a bit more. You get to a certain threshold, you give it an irrigation, and then when it tension rises again, you give it another irrigation. And from a plant point of view, the tension is the most accurate way of reflecting how easy, how stressful it is for the water uptake, how much osmosis is occurring, because it will cope with different substrates, and as the substrate ages and its physical performance changes, it will still give you the tension. So I personally think that using microtensiometers and working on tension is the most accurate method of assessing plant water requirements. But also I know that the technology isn't widely used, and it's more expensive than using volumetric moisture content measurements that other technologies can use. So I don't have a problem with people using whatever technology as long as they can work out the correlation. And what we see is that with when people are using the moisture content, the VMC method, which I'll explain about 10 sensors which can measure the moisture content, then you need to correlate them either by using a moisture retention, a PF curve, to get the right tension, or we can do it manually. We can actually irrigate them until we see runoff, measure the tension, measure the moisture content, and that's pretty much a container capacity. And we can do a little bit of work on wetting them up to different levels, seeing what the moisture content is, seeing where the runoff occurs, and then trying to scale back a little bit from that to give us the right level of moisture content. So the technologies that are used for measuring moisture content, then we have 2 main technologies. We have capacitance probes, and they'll measure soil moisture content every 10 centimeters along the length of this probe. And you can get different lengths of probe for different situations, for soil and substrate. Here's an example of one that was put into a 7-litre pot. I prefer to use these little 10 centimetre ones because they're less obtrusive. But you can get some very nice data from the way that the moisture content changes with these probes, and then you can start to decide on when's the right point to irrigate or what volumetric moisture content you should be irrigating your substrate. They're quite expensive, so you can't have thousands of these on a farm. And when you look in the literature, there's some debate about their accuracy when you move from one substrate to another, because they haven't necessarily been calibrated to the capacitance, if you want to call it, curve of that particular substrate. Each soil, each substrate has a slightly different response curve in terms of moisture content to the capacitance, and they're not necessarily calibrated to different substrates, so you need a bit of guesswork to get it right. The other technology that's used a lot is TDR, time domain reflectometry, and there's different products available. They basically have these 2 or 3 steel rods that you insert into your substrate, or you can have them statically employed. You can put them, just have them permanently connected to one particular area, and they give an average reading over the length of the rods. So clearly you need to make sure you know what's going on in the profile. These will give you a reading at different depths. This will only give you a reading at the particular depth you've got the probe put into. But in the literature it says that they tend to be more accurate and cheaper. I'm not sure about the cheapness, but one of the common devices that I use, Delta T wet sensor, then they have substrate calibrations. They're calibrated for coir, for peat, for rock wool. So they give you a slightly more accurate VMC measurement, and they'll give you a different measurement if you set it for different things. So it's I think a slightly more accurate way of getting a reading. But you know, you can do your own calibration, if you want to call it, with the capacitance ones. The advantage that these products have, TDR devices, is that they're more portable. You can go around poking them, probing them into your substrate. So a person who's going out doing his squeeze test can also do some VMC tests over the whole farm. So they're quite good for cross-checking what's going on in a few static locations or with your runoff. So last slide I'm going to say is when we set up these devices, whether it's a runoff, whether it's a VMC, whether it's a capacitance, we generally try and set them up in a particular way to try and match the irrigation demand of our crops. And the best way that we found generally is to use a three-phase strategy. So what happens is we normally say that if during the 24-hour cycle of a crop, then it goes through different phases. It dries back a little bit at night. It has a big water demand during the peak part of the day. And then we have to get it from that dry back to the to a sufficiently moist state to cope with the high water demand, you know, as the weather improves. So we normally divide our irrigation into 3 different phases and set slightly different trigger points or thresholds. We talk about phase 1 and manage wet up. And in this particular case, the grower has said, well, from 2 hours after sunrise, and this is the middle of the summer, so sunrise is about 4:30 a.m. in our location, until 8:30 a.m., so about 3 or 4 times, then he's just going to irrigate hourly. He's slowly going to take it from a high tension at just before sunrise to bring it down. And then when we get to 8:30, then he's going to start to cope with the peak demand that that crop is going to experience. So we'll set his tension at 31 millibars in this particular case. You could say we set the moisture content at 65%. And the idea is that when you get to that threshold, then it triggers an irrigation and it drops the tension. And then because of the temperature, the VPD, the tension starts to rise with crop water use, gets to that threshold, drops it again. So you can see this process going on, what we call our peak demand, and we're trying to get it so that we have some runoff during this period. In phase 1, then we wet it up slowly to make sure we get to runoff by the 2nd or 3rd drip cycle of the day, and then we want sufficiently frequent irrigations to cause runoff on pretty much every cycle during this peak period. And then as we get towards the end of our growing day, then we start to think about drying it back, and we don't suddenly stop the watering. In this particular case, we're going to raise the tension threshold so that we're starting to allow the substrate to dry back a little bit more than it would during the peak part of the day. So we're gradually starting to dry back, and that goes on from 5 p.m. till 2 hours before sunset, at which point we stop watering, and you can see the tension gradually rises until we start the whole process the next day. So just in this particular case, then the grower had 4 drippers in a meter, 160 mils per 1 meter coir bag. He gave 26 drip cycles with this particular strategy, and sunrise was at 4:24 and sunset at 21:50. So that just gives you an idea how that grower is managing. But you can do exactly the same with measuring moisture content, or we do the same with radiation, radsum as well. We have these 3 different phases, if you want to call it. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I'm hoping that was useful for you. Are there any questions arising from that?
At this time, feel free to put any questions you might have in the Q&A box. We did have a few come through. I'll read them out so everybody can hear them, and Dennis will address them as best he can.
Okay. Yeah.
You went over 4 types of methods for scheduling irrigation. Do you have a preference between using solar radiation or substrate moisture content when it comes to triggering irrigation?
So my preference is for tension, because I think that's most accurately reflects the way that the plant responds to water use effectively, and it sort of the tension, the plant. We trigger an irrigation event at say 31 millibars, and when we measure volumetric moisture content, that's going to be different than moisture content at 31 millibars for lots of different substrates. With a tensiometer, then it's 31 millibars, and it doesn't matter what the substrate is, it's automatically correlated for that, for the change in the physical nature of the substrate. So that makes it quite useful. The most common method globally, I suspect, is probably using weather station data, using radiation sum. And again, I have lots of growers do that. You have to be careful about the influence of wind, but that works pretty well as well. So using tension or using light, I think, are probably the 2 most common and my preferred methods. But I'm very happy if people have a good Wayscale method or a good VMC method, and they calibrate it according to the particular requirements of that substrate, they can get good results. And even I've got some growers who are still using time clocks, and they work okay with it. They can still give pretty good and accurate irrigation. They have to work damn hard for it, but it works. But I would say tension or light radiation sum is probably the 2 most common methods that I'm most familiar with and seem to work well for most of our growers.
That's pretty interesting. I guess if the age of your substrate changes and the tension changes, then your irrigation will change right along with it if you're measuring your tension. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of tension. As the physical nature of your substrate changes, the tension is still the tension. And so it automatically compensates for that change. Whereas we've had some quite big discussions, you could say, with irrigation scheduling companies, because they've been working on it's 65% is your trigger point. And that's fine when you start off with that particular substrate. But after a year, then the physical nature of the substrate has changed quite a lot. And if they don't adjust their trigger point, then the crop is getting a bit too dry. It should have been more like 75% the trigger point for irrigation, because of the reduction in pore sizes, because of root ingress, reduction in the actual particle sizes, and even a little bit of compression or compaction. So yeah, I prefer that method, but I also know it's not so widely used. And as long as people understand what they're trying to do, then measuring volumetric moisture content also gives very good results.
We had another question come in. I heard day neutral strawberries can be sensitive to high temperatures during the summer and reduce fruit set. If irrigating properly, as you described, could this be eliminated to protect cover, or are shade net clouds used at times?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And my answer is that you can, to a degree, help the plant by irrigating properly and keeping it at low tension. But what often happens is that the thing that causes a problem with day neutral plants and the poor fruit set is the high night temperature. And you can't really irrigate a lot at night. It's the fact that it's very high night temperature. The plant is working quite hard at night, as we all do with these hot nights, and respiring a lot. So it uses a lot of the energy it makes during the day and runs out of steam when it's producing new flowers. So although you might help it a little bit by irrigating properly, the key is in trying to manage the climate that the plant's experiencing. And if you give it some shade, it may help reduce the solar gain of the soil and the plants during the day, so might keep the night a little bit cooler. Certainly shading it with some white reflective material can help. So it's a combination. During the day, you might be able to help it by irrigating properly, but you're probably going to have to look at trying to keep that plant a bit cooler as well with some shading.
So you talked a lot about vertigation, not so much, or sorry, irrigation. You didn't bring in a lot of vertigation into the presentation. For the newer growers, how often are you fertilizing?
Okay, yeah. So my apologies. With the limited time, then it's obviously certain things I've cut out. So that was one of them. Generally, with fertigation in substrate, then we're dripping pretty much every time we water. So clearly, in a baby crop, when we've just started, we might not need to drip too often, and we might not need to fertilize too often. But once the crop starts to grow, then we're fertilizing every watering, and we're then checking the EC and doing some analysis of the drip and the drain and the substrate, just to see if we're getting, too much or too little fertilizer and making some adjustments. But generally with substrate, then if you go 2 or 3 days without any fertilizer, then you wash everything out of the substrate zone, and you have to work quite hard to get it back up before you see some nutrient deficiencies. And the other thing that's really important is to keep the pH much lower than we would in soil. We typically will, in coir, try and drip around about 5.3, 5.5, and we try and keep the substrate below 6, because we find otherwise that the iron, manganese, zinc, copper availability drops quite significantly. So we work quite hard on maintaining the pH low and managing the EC of our substrate, but we're pretty much dripping with fertilizer every water.
So it's never a case where you're putting on straight water to get that rinsate that you're looking for. You're always having some fertilizer in the solution.
The ideal is yes. I mean, clearly, if things get out of hand and we've got a huge EC spike, it might be beneficial to do a few cycles of plain water, or ideally water that's been corrected for pH. So we don't introduce huge amounts of bicarbonates into our substrate, which causes us a problem with the iron. So I could say in principle, then no, we're always trying to give a dilute fertilizer solution, but in practical terms, there are sometimes those situations where a flush or two with plain water is the quickest way to get it down, and so we would do that as well.
So when it comes to drippers, are all drippers created equal? I mean, they have different output, but the basic design of them, are they all the same, or is there something you should be looking for?
Well, we try and work for substrate. We try and work with drippers for the crops that I grow between 1 and 2 litre per hour generally, and we have this golden rule that for strawberries grown in substrate, we normally try and get around about 6 litres per metre per hour. So we can have 5 1.2 litre an hour drippers or 4 1.5 litre an hour drippers. And that gives us, depending on the nature of the substrate, we might need slightly more uniform application. The coarse free draining substrate's better with 5 drippers. The less coarse substrate with more capillary action, we can get away with 4. But essentially, yeah, you're trying to look at 2 things. One is, what's the physical nature of your substrate? What's the wetting distribution pattern like? And the coarser it is, the more point sources you need. And so you have more emitters but slightly lower output. If your substrate is more moisture retentive and we get a fatter water distribution pattern, then you could go with slightly higher output and fewer emitters, if that makes sense. But I normally 1.5 to 2 litre an hour drippers are most used really in substrate for a variety of crops.
Some emitters are straight and others have a 90-degree angle in them. Is that preference, or is there any difference between between those?
Well, I guess it depends on how your crop's set up. So if you've got a crop where it's sort of raised off the ground, then sometimes a 90-degree angle is quite use. Where if it's sort of quite close to the ground, then a straight spike, if you want to call it, is good. I've got growers that also use a hose, and they will either lay that on top of open troughs or even go to the time and expense of threading it through bags with pressure compensated drippers, and then you haven't got all this spaghetti all over the place. And they prefer that because they say it's much less maintenance required because the spaghetti doesn't get pulled out or damaged all the time. So there's different ways to achieve it, but the most important thing is obviously making sure you've got the right output and the right number for your substrate, your crop that you're growing.
So we also had a grower ask, why am I seeing wet spots and dry spots along my trough or between bags?
Yeah, I mean, there can be a whole range of things. I've got a couple of slides in reserve, which if you want, I can go through. But it's to say why this can happen. I mean, once we move into containerized production, you suddenly realize that not all plants are the same, not all drippers are the same, and the climate has quite a big influence, and there's variation, you know, from what we think is a field or a glass house. We see actually quite big differences, and you'll see that because you start to see drier areas and wetter areas, and the worst, you know, we see everything from two adjacent pots, and one dry and one very wet. And that could be for a whole variety of reasons: the size of the plant, the problem with the dripper output, or we see, you know, a temperature variation from one end of the field to the other. If there's a slope, then, as you know, the top of the field is going to be a lot warmer because of the chimney effect of the warm air rising. And so, you know, those plants at the top of the field, the highest point, need a lot more irrigation than the ones at the lowest point. So once we move into this, you know, containerized production, all those variabilities that you might not pick up so easily in the soil grown crop become much more evident. And then we have to obviously look at how to adjust our irrigation to cope with that. And it might be having smaller valves to cope with variability in climate. It might be having to replace our drippers or clean our drippers because we're getting build-up of crud. It might be looking at the structures we grow in and trying to, you know, provide a more uniform climate in them. Certainly, we have to provide, you know, as uniform plant size, substrate, and container as possible because we want to try and minimize the variation. And one of the things that we do is we use surfactants sometimes. If we have wet and dry spots and we want to try and wet things up as quickly as possible, unify everything, try and, you know, get wet up some of those dry areas without over wetting other areas, we add a surfactant to the water. You know, there's various materials, H2 flow is one of them. Put it often into our fertilizer stock tank at a set rate, and that surfactant will help to spread the water more uniformly in the dry areas, and we get a quicker and more uniform distribution of water. So that's a sort of process that we often advise where we do get these wet and dry spots appearing.
Great, thank you. Good description. So just for me, sort of side note here, I've got another question. So we talked a lot about runoff today. Is there sort of a magic number that we're aiming for, or is it set each birthday? What are you looking for there?
Sorry, Talia, I just missed that.
Try shutting down your video and see how you come across.
Okay, is that better?
Not that good.
It's still not. Maybe just type your question in and I'll repeat it for everybody. Talia's muted herself, so I hope she's still there.
Yeah.
Dennis, you mentioned you had some extra slides there. I'm not sure if you covered everything on them. Here she comes through with her question. I'll repeat it so everybody can hear it. We talked a lot about runoff today. Is there a magic number to shoot for the total runoff for the day?
I mean, that's a really good question. And the answer is there's no one magic number. We tend to use a range from sort of 5 to 25, 30%, but it depends on the circumstance. For instance, dealing with growers in quite warm places like California and Morocco, where the water quality is not very good, it's got quite high background sodium and chloride, they would say, well, we have to have 35, 40% runoff or even higher, because otherwise the sodium and the chloride level just builds up to a level that becomes crop limiting. So, you know, they're using a lot of water just to try and manage the sodium and the chloride. I think there are other ways for them to do it, but that's their decision at this moment. I think you could look at using reverse osmosis to reduce the sodium and chloride level. They could possibly look at the way that they're fertilizing, and part of the problem in California is they use a lot of sulfuric acid as well, and that just adds to the EC. If they switch to using nitric acid, I think it would be a more manageable situation. So the answer is probably between 10 and 25% in reasonably good water, and from 25 to 40% in poor quality water with quite high background levels of sodium and chloride is probably where most people would be. When we have very low transpiration conditions, small plants, cool weather, you can get away with less runoff because the demand for the plants and the water and fertilizer application is much less.
Does that change through the day? You start with less runoff at the beginning of the day because you want to re-wet things, and as you move through the day, you increase that percentage of runoff. Is that correct? Yeah,
I mean, what tends to happen, obviously, because you've had a dry down at night, then your first 1 or 2 irrigations, we're not wanting to see too much runoff. And then from the 3rd drip onwards, we would want to start to see runoff. And clearly, yes, during the hottest part of the day is when we probably want to see the most runoff. We want to have the most water available to our plants, and the risk of overwatering them is a bit less than, you know, when it's very early or very late in the day. So you would see the runoff increase from, you know, the 2nd drip to the 3rd or 4th drip, and then we probably want to maintain it at a reasonable level until towards the end of the day, when again we'll start to allow a bit less runoff to start with the dry back. But there can be events, you know, if for instance we have a build-up of conductivity, we might go for a 40% runoff flush in the middle of the day, in addition to what we're sort of, you know, scheduling just as a routine basis.
I don't see any other questions coming in, so maybe we'll close things down there. I really appreciate Dennis taking the time to go over that material with us today. On the screen today, you will see the CEU credits if you're applying for those for today's session. Really appreciate Talia for putting this together. And with that, I think we'll sign off. Take care, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Sonny. Thank you.